On the evening of October 14, 1967, a wheat and sorghum farmer named Roy Whitfield was closing up his barn outside Ellsworth, Kansas, when he saw something walk through the low ground at the eastern edge of his sorghum field. He would spend the rest of his life describing that walk, not a run, not a stumble, a walk, unhurried, deliberate, the gait of something that knew exactly where it was going and felt no particular urgency about getting there. Roy went inside to call his brother, who lived 4 miles down the county road. He never got the chance. By the time he reached the porch, there was already a car in his driveway that had not been there 90 seconds earlier, and 2 men in dark suits were stepping out of it. And Roy Whitfield, by his own later account, never told a single soul what he had seen that night for the better part of 4 decades. I want to begin not with Roy Whitfield the man, but with the field itself, and with the arithmetic that never stopped bothering his son Daniel, who first told me this story. Ellsworth County in 1967 was, and largely still is, open country, flat wheat ground broken occasionally by shelter belts and section line roads that run for miles without a single turn. The nearest town with anything resembling a sheriff's substation was Ellsworth itself, roughly 11 miles by county road from the Whitfield place. The nearest phone line other than Roy's own ran to a neighboring farm 2 miles east, and the nearest paved highway sat a further 6 miles beyond that. There was no highway patrol barracks in the immediate area, no military installation, nothing that Daniel has ever been able to identify that would explain how any vehicle, driven by anyone, official or otherwise, could have covered enough ground to arrive in Roy's driveway within the window his own account allows. Roy told his son, decades later, that he estimated no more than 2 minutes passed between the moment he turned away from the field and the moment the car's headlights swept across his porch. 2 minutes. 11 miles, at minimum, from anywhere a car of that description would plausibly have been idling and waiting. That gap, more than the sighting itself, is the detail Daniel Whitfield has spent the better part of 30 years unable to let go of. Here is what Roy described, consistently. Across the handful of times over his life, he permitted himself to speak about it. He had gone out just after sundown to check a gate along the fence line that separated his sorghum field from a stretch of unplanted pasture to the east, a chore he performed most evenings that time of year. The light was failing, but not gone, that particular blue hour of a Kansas autumn evening, where distances become difficult to judge and the horizon seems to recede the longer you look at it. He said he noticed movement near the tree line first, low and pale against the darker ground, and his first assumption, a reasonable one for a man who had farmed that land his whole life, was that it was a stray dog or a coyote working the fence line for a way through. His own dog, a blue heeler named Scout who normally accompanied him on the evening walk, had stopped dead about 40 yards back and would not come any closer, standing rigid with his ears flat. And Roy said afterward that he had noticed this and dismissed it at the time as the dog simply catching a coyote scent on the wind. It was not until the shape straightened, fully upright, that he understood he was looking at something roughly 4.5 feet tall, grayish in color, with an oversized head and limbs that moved with an evenness he found unsettling, precisely because nothing about it looked labored or unsure. Nothing about it looked like it was walking on ground that gave the way ordinary ground gives underfoot. It crossed perhaps 60 yards of open field in full view, unhurried, and passed through a gap in the fence Roy knew for a fact was too narrow for a grown man to fit through without turning sideways and ducking. It did not turn sideways. It did not duck. He told Daniel that the strangest part was not the walking itself, but the fact that the figure never once looked toward him. Not directly. Not even a turn of the head, and yet he had the unmistakable, almost physical sense the entire time that it knew precisely where he was standing, and had accounted for him the way a person accounts for a fence post, present, noted, and irrelevant to the errand at hand. He also mentioned, though only ever in passing and only in the last retelling before his death, that the air along that stretch of fence had felt noticeably colder than the rest of the field, a difference he could not explain, and had never experienced before or since in 30 years of walking that same ground at that same hour. Roy did not, by his son's account, panic in any dramatic sense. He was 51 years old that autumn, a man who had spent 3 decades running the farm largely alone since his first wife's death in 1961, and Daniel describes him as almost aggressively unshakable, the kind of man who dealt with a stillborn calf, or a collapsed well, or a fire in the north pasture with the same flat, practical calm he brought to a broken axle. What he did, according to the story he eventually told, was watch the figure until it passed beyond the tree line and out of sight, wait a further several minutes standing perfectly still in the field, and then walk back toward the house at a normal pace, go inside, and pick up the telephone to call his brother Walt, intending, he said, simply to ask if anyone else on that stretch of road had seen anything strange that evening. Nothing more dramatic than that, the sort of call a man makes about a downed power line or a loose bull. He never completed the call. He said he heard tires on gravel before he had finished dialing the second digit, looked out the kitchen window, and saw headlights already swinging into his drive from the county road, a road on which, moments before, standing on his own porch checking the sky, he had seen no lights at all in either direction. 2 men got out of a plain, dark sedan, a car Roy would later describe as neither new nor old, unmarked in any way he could recall despite being asked about it more than once over the years, and lacking, he was fairly certain, though never entirely certain, any visible license plate on the front. Both wore dark suits, which struck him immediately as strange, because in that part of Kansas on a Saturday evening in October of 1967, a suit meant either a funeral, a wedding, or a traveling insurance man, and these two had the bearing of neither, moving with an unhurried economy that Roy later said reminded him, uncomfortably, of the way the figure in the field had moved. They did not introduce themselves by name. The taller of the two asked him, according to Roy's account, whether he had seen anything unusual on his property in the last half hour. Roy said he told them no. He told Daniel, decades later, that he lied instinctively, before he had even consciously decided to, the way a hand pulls back from a hot stove, before the brain finishes registering the heat. The shorter of the 2 men looked past Roy into the lit doorway of the house for a long moment, then back at him, and said something Roy repeated to his son almost word for word on more than one occasion, across the years that followed. He said, "It would be better for you and for your family if that stays true." Then, without any further exchange, the 2 men returned to the car and were gone, the taillights shrinking down the county road far faster, Roy always insisted, than the speed limit or the condition of that gravel road should reasonably have allowed. Roy Whitfield stood on his own porch in the dark for what he estimated was a very long time afterward, before he could bring himself to go back inside and turn off the kitchen light. What happened in the weeks and months that followed is where the available evidence becomes fragmentary, but not, I think, insignificant. Roy's brother Walt, in a set of recollections he shared with Daniel before his own death in 1988, remembered Roy becoming noticeably withdrawn that autumn, missing 2 consecutive Sunday dinners at their mother's house, without explanation or apology. Something Walt said had never happened before in all the years he could remember, Roy having been, in Walt's words, the most reliably present man in the family for every holiday and obligation going back to their childhood. A neighboring farmer named Elton Kraft, whom Daniel eventually located through an old Grange Association roster in the early 2000s, recalled that Roy had, sometime that same fall, asked him in an offhand, almost too casual way, whether he'd ever noticed strange cars on the county road at odd hours. A question Kraft found peculiar enough at the time that he still remembered the specific wording, 35 years later, when Daniel finally tracked him down. Kraft also recalled, unprompted, that Roy had that winter put up a taller section of fence along the eastern property line, work that struck Kraft as unusual, given that no livestock had ever needed containing on that particular stretch. Small data points, individually, none of them proof of anything on their own, but taken together, examined the way Daniel has spent decades examining them, they form the outline of a man learning, in real time and without any manual to guide him, how to carry something he had been told, however obliquely, never to put down. There is a second thread to this story that Daniel did not encounter until much later, and it involves paperwork. In 1994, going through his father's effects while helping move him into a smaller house in town after a health scare, Daniel found, Tucked into a metal lockbox alongside the farm's original deed and a handful of insurance documents, a single sheet of onion skin paper, official in appearance though bearing no letterhead, typed with a case reference number in the upper corner and a short paragraph advising the recipient, referred to only as the reporting party, that the matter discussed on the date in question had been classified and that further disclosure could result in legal consequences under statutes the document did not specify by name. There was no signature, only an illegible initial beneath a line that read, simply, "For file." Daniel spent years afterward trying to trace the document through Freedom of Information requests filed with the Air Force, whose Project Blue Book investigative unit was still formally active in the autumn of 1967, and was told repeatedly, in letters he has shown me, that no record matching the case reference number printed on the onion skin sheet could be located in the searchable index, that materials from that period and region had, in the specific wording of one 2007 response, been transferred to a records holding facility and were not currently available for individual search request. Not destroyed, not denied outright, transferred. That particular distinction, Daniel has said to me more than once, sitting at his own kitchen table with the folder of correspondence in front of him, is the one thing that has kept him from simply letting the entire matter go, the way most of his friends who know the story have quietly encouraged him to. In 2016, he tried a different approach, filing a request not for the case file itself, but for any general correspondence logs from the relevant Blue Book field office, covering the final 2 weeks of October 1967, hoping a broader net might surface something the narrower request had missed. That request came back with 3 pages, heavily redacted, listing dates and case numbers, with almost everything else blacked out, except for a single surviving line that read, "Farm visit conducted, matter resolved, no further action recommended, dated October 15, 1967, the day after Roy's encounter. No name, no location, no case number that matched anything Daniel had on file. Just that one unredacted sentence, sitting in the middle of an otherwise blackened page. Roy Whitfield did not speak about the encounter again, as far as Daniel or Walt or anyone else in the family has ever indicated to me, for nearly 40 years. He remarried in 1971 to a schoolteacher named Helen, raised Daniel and his younger sister Carol on the same farm, and by every outward account lived what looked, from a distance, like an entirely unremarkable rural life. County fair entries, church on Sundays, a decent wheat crop most years and a hard one in others. Carol, whom I spoke with separately from Daniel specifically to see whether their memories would independently align, describes her father as a quiet man but not, in her word, a haunted one. Someone who seemed settled into something rather than tormented by it. That word, settled, is one Daniel used entirely independently in his own description of his father's later years, and it is precisely the kind of small, unprompted agreement between 2 separate accounts, gathered separately and compared only afterward, that tends to catch an investigator's attention rather than dismiss it. Helen, before her own death in 2003, once told Carol that Roy had a habit, most evenings after supper for as long as she'd known him, of sitting alone on the east porch facing the sorghum field until it was fully dark, not reading, not smoking, simply watching the tree line, the way another man might watch a television. She said she asked him about it exactly once, early in their marriage, and he told her only that it was where he did his thinking, and she never asked again. It was in the spring of 2009, in a hospital room in Salina, Kansas, with both Daniel and Carol present at his bedside, that Roy Whitfield finally told the story in full. The field, the dog that would not come closer, the walk, the fence gap too narrow for a man, the phone call he never finished, the 2 men, the sentence one of them spoke to him on his own porch. He was 82 years old and, by his children's account, entirely lucid. More lucid, Carol has said, than he had been in the preceding several days of his decline. When Daniel asked him why he had waited so long to say any of it, Roy reportedly said only that he had made a kind of promise to himself that night on the porch, not to the 2 men, to himself, that he would carry it for as long as he had something left worth protecting, and that toward the very end of his life, there simply wasn't much left that telling the truth could put at any real risk. I want to be careful here about what this account does and does not establish. It does not establish that Roy Whitfield watched an extraterrestrial being cross his sorghum field on a specific October evening in 1967. It does not establish that the two men who arrived at his farm within an all but impossible window of time were government agents of any kind, or that the document Daniel found sealed in the lockbox was genuine rather than some kind of local prank, an insurance scare tactic, or a misunderstanding that simply outlived its own mundane explanation. What it does establish, at least to my satisfaction, is a pattern that is difficult to manufacture after the fact out of nothing at all. A specific, internally consistent sensory account, down to the behavior of a family dog, maintained without meaningful variation across 4 decades of occasional, reluctant retelling. A documented, independently corroborated shift in a man's ordinary behavior in the weeks immediately following the alleged event, corroborated by 2 separate people who did not compare notes with each other until Daniel brought them together decades later. A physical document whose existence I have personally seen a photograph of, and whose provenance neither Daniel nor any federal agency he has spent years contacting has ever been able to satisfactorily explain. And an unexplained arrival time that, however generously you want to account for it, does not comfortably fit the known geography of Ellsworth County, Kansas, in the autumn of 1967. There is one more detail Daniel shared with me that I have thought about more than almost anything else in this particular case. In the lockbox alongside the onion skin document, there was a second item, a small fragment of grayish material, roughly the size of a thumbnail, brittle and strikingly lightweight for its density, that Roy had apparently kept for decades without ever explaining to anyone where it came from or how it had come into his possession. Daniel had it examined in 2011 by a materials science lab at a regional university on the condition of anonymity for both the lab and the family, a condition the lab's director insisted on before agreeing to run any tests at all. The report, which Daniel showed me in a redacted form with the lab's name blacked out, described the fragment as a metallic alloy with a composition the technician was, in his own carefully hedged phrasing, unable to positively match to any commercial, industrial, or naturally occurring material, catalogued in the lab's available reference library. Unable to match, not classified as unusual in any dramatic sense, not identified as synthetic in any obvious or alarming way, simply, and specifically, unmatched against everything the lab had on file. Roy never told anyone in his family where the fragment had come from, and by the time anyone thought to ask him about it directly, in those final lucid weeks in the Salina hospital, no one remembered to, and by the time Daniel remembered to ask, it was already too late. Roy Whitfield was not, by any account available to me, a man given to invention or embellishment. He read no science fiction that either of his children can recall. He never once, in nearly 40 years of silence, brought up flying saucers or little green men at a dinner table, the way plenty of men of his generation did, as a joke or a conversation starter. His interests, according to Daniel and Carol both, ran to tractor mechanics, the Kansas City Royals, and a battered set of Zane Grey westerns he reread every few winters. He was not primed for a story like this one by any prior fascination with the subject, and he did not, after that October evening, develop one either, which is itself a small and telling absence in a story built almost entirely out of absences, missing minutes, a transferred rather than denied file, an unmatched fragment, and 40 years of a man's deliberate, disciplined silence. I have spent a considerable amount of time now with the Whitfield family's account, with the photographed copy of the onion skin letter, with the materials lab report, with Carol and Daniel's independent and remarkably consistent memories of their father's demeanor across the decades that followed that single October evening. I am not prepared to tell you that a gray being walked through a Kansas wheat farmer's sorghum field in 1967. I am not prepared to tell you that 2 unidentified men arrived at that farm within a window of time that defies the ordinary physics of rural travel, or that a federal document instructing a private citizen into decades of silence genuinely sits today in some government archive, rather than having originated, more mundanely, from a lockbox in central Kansas. I am not prepared to tell you any of that, but I am no longer prepared to dismiss it either. Because whatever else this story is, it does not behave the way an invention tends to behave. Inventions tend to grow more elaborate the longer you sit with them, more detailed, more dramatic, reaching for bigger and bigger claims to hold your attention. This one has done the opposite. Every thread I have pulled on, the impossible arrival time, the transferred file, the unmatched fragment, the two independent accounts of a man growing quietly, permanently different after a single evening, has only tightened rather than unraveled the longer I have looked at it. Roy Whitfield carried something for the better part of 40 years and then, in the last months of his life, set it down carefully in front of the two people he trusted most in the world. What was crossing that field on an October evening in 1967, and why did it matter enough to someone that a car could reach an isolated Kansas farmhouse within 2 minutes of a single old man noticing something strange in the failing light? Who were the two men, and under what authority, if any beyond their own evident certainty, did they operate that evening? What happened to the case file that was transferred rather than closed, and where, in whatever archive still holds it, does it sit today, forgotten or otherwise? And if Roy Whitfield could be found, and warned, and silenced within minutes of an encounter he never sought out and had not yet told a single living soul about, how many others across that same stretch of open Kansas country might have seen something similar in those same years, and simply never spoke of it at all, not to a neighbor, not to a brother, not even, in the end, to their own children? I don't know. I'm not sure anyone still living is in a position to know.